federal government has decided to invoke the never before used Emergency Measures Act. MPs confirmed the government's decision to do so tonight. Coming up today on the program, exclusive reaction from various people on the government's decision to do so. Coming up, I'll speak to the interim leader of the Green Party of Canada, Dr. Amita Kuttner, where they will provide their insight on the government's decision to do so. Plus, they'll also touch on the way that their MPs voted. Then I'll speak to freelance journalist Dale Smith and former Conservative MP Jeff Watson, where they will provide more insight on the government's decision to do so. Then I'll speak to the Conservative Deputy Industry Shadow Minister and MP for the Bay of Quinte, where he will provide the Conservative perspective. And finally, I'll speak to strategist Scott Reid, where he will break down why he thinks that the Emergency Measures Act should be time limited and why he thinks it should be invoked. That is all coming up today on the Wyatt Sharp Show. With me now is the interim leader of the Green Party of Canada, Dr. Amita Kuttner. Thank you so much for joining me. Maybe we can start out with the results of the Emergency Measures Act vote that took place today and how some of the MPs in your caucus voted. Speak a little bit about, obviously, one of the biggest things about the Green Party is, they don't whip votes like some of the other parties do. Can you speak a little bit as to what the importance of that was for a vote such as this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me as well, Wyatt. It's great to be here. This was absolutely a historic vote and a historic moment, the first real use of the Emergencies Act. And it's true. Our two MPs voted in different directions. So Elizabeth May voted for continuing use of the act and Mike Morris voted against it. And I really do think with something so important and so historic that making sure that MPs have the ability to make the best decision that they feel like they can make on available information, on collaboration with other parties, and on the wishes of their constituents is super important. And definitely on a vote of this magnitude and this complexity and with this much division, it is the right moment to set aside the tendency of so many parties to control their votes.
So I guess then just kind of one more question on that part of it, and in terms of how the Green Party votes, because this is such a divisive issue. Obviously, it's a good thing that different MPs can vote kind of their conscience as to what they feel, because that could help, I guess, alleviate some of the divisiveness around the issue. But do you see it as a problem that around such a divisive issue, some members within your own caucus have different perspectives?
No, I don't actually. I think if our conversations had been ones that were angry or divisive in themselves, then I would have had an issue with it. But no, there was just differences of opinion and lots of respect for each other. So in a sense, I think that gave me hope that if this practice was actually more widely used, that the conversation would be more amicable overall.
And in terms of, obviously, you've mentioned it, the Emergency Measures Act is, it's very historic. It hasn't been used before. In terms of your position on it as the, interim leader of the party, what do you see, the future of this being? I mean, a lot of the protesters in Ottawa around what's being described as the red zone have been kind of cleared out. However, there does seem to be a lot of protesters still in Ottawa on, streets that are not within the red zone. Do you personally think that the Emergency Measures Act will help with that?
It's interesting because over the course of the weekend, in trying to support both my MPs in making their decisions, I was wondering if I should take a position. And I decided that I was not going to have all the information that I felt like I needed to personally make a decision on it, and rather was just trying to appreciate their process and support them both in it. So I made the decision myself not to pick a side, in a sense, to be the best facilitator in that conversation. I do think what's really important now, especially with the protesters and I would say the occupation getting cleared out finally, that where the nature of the emergency that I was still seeing happening is around the foreign influence and foreign interference, both in terms of controlling narratives that are going on that people are believing, and also the rise of white supremacy. So these things, I think, need to be taken extremely seriously. And whether this is a continuance of use of this act, or whether this is just a number of different measures, also measures around policing, that those need to be things that everybody can get behind.
And then just one more final question before we conclude. Obviously, the main message around some of what's being now described as an occupation, obviously, it's kept a large portion of Ottawa residents not able to go about their daily lives. In terms of the overall messaging of, what this now occupation was, it was to largely go against vaccination, COVID restrictions. In terms of, the message that these protesters was trying to display, the message that was coming from the Conservative Party was that it's important to at least hear what they're trying to say so that they feel like they've been heard, so then they can eventually go home. Do you feel that there's any truth to, the message that's coming from your colleagues in the Conservative Party?
Yes and no. So I think that there's two pieces to that. I think that the demands of the convoy itself were less about the discussion around mandates and how the mandates were implemented than is generally thought. And I've talked to many people who have concerns around the implementation of the mandates that I think does need to be discussed. But I think in the end, the convoy requests, which included overthrowing the government, were not actually that discussion. So I think there's truth to it, but it's actually perhaps a little disingenuous to say that's really all that we're asking for. Because if that really was the conversation, it would have been important to have. But because there was so much more to it, threats of overthrow, threats of violence, the threads of white supremacy, it could not be that simple. And I would add in everybody here, I think, has a responsibility in the way that this has turned into a divisive conversation. And the fact that, what I experienced with my caucus, which is two people being able to respectfully have different opinions, I think it meant that there was a discussion that still needed to be finished. And that's probably where I landed with it.
Okay, that is Dr. Amita Kuttner. They made time to join the program on what was a very busy day in Canadian politics. So appreciate you joining me, and it's been great chatting with you as always.
Thank you.
With me now is Jeff Watson, former Conservative MP and former Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transport, as well as Dale Smith, who is a freelance journalist in the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Dale, maybe I can start out with you, maybe just from sort of, the role that you've played in, covering the ongoing events in Ottawa as a journalist. Obviously, the Emergency Measures Act that was just passed in the House of Commons today. I guess, what is your overall reaction to the decision to invoke the Emergency Measures Act, and how might this change the way that, you will report on some of the ongoing events that have took place in the nation's capital?
So just for clarity purposes, it wasn't the act itself that was voted on, it was a declaration stemming from the act. So just so that we've got that bit of technical clarity there. But in terms of what I think it's going to change is just looking forward to once the Senate passes their own declaration, which should probably be tomorrow. After that, a special parliamentary committee is going to be set up, which is going to do real-time monitoring of the actions going on stemming from what the order is. And so when we have names for who's going to sit on that committee, because it's going to contain both MPs and senators, I think that'll give us something to really focus on in terms of what is going forward in terms, who's looking after what's going on under the powers that have been invoked.
Jeff, you're a former Conservative MP. All Conservative MPs voted against this tonight. I guess, what do you think that message? What do you think the message should be that is sent to the federal government if all members of the Conservative caucus and the Bloc Québécois voted against this? Obviously, the government has, the support of the NDP, so it was able to get passed. But what do you think it says that, two major parties in the House of Commons voted against what has been over the course of, the last over 20 days now, what has been a pretty divisive issue?
Well, I think it says that the Prime Minister and his government have not made a satisfactory case either at the beginning or certainly now that the border blockades are gone and the protest itself has been dispersed, that there's a satisfactory case for the use of extraordinary powers under the Emergency Act. There surely can be no meaningful justification to continue them. I suspect New Democrats, maybe even some Liberals, who signaled that they might not be comfortable with the continuation of these powers, it took the implied, if not explicit, threat of an election in order to keep them supporting this continuation. So I think there's a lot of concern about how the government has proceeded, and the government should be very cautious in moving forward at this point.
Dale, maybe a similar question to you as I just asked Jeff. I mean, in terms of, the way that various MPs and various parties voted on this, obviously the way that, the House of Commons currently, I guess, is set out, the government only needs the support of the NDP to pass whatever bill they put forward. But do you think anything should be, taken in by the government, that the fact that, the Conservatives, which is obviously the official opposition, and the Bloc Québécois, who's also a fairly major party and represents a large majority of Quebec voters, do you think anything should be learned from the government?
It depends on, I guess, what message you're trying to take from what their opposition was. Conservatives have largely downplayed what has taken place, and in some cases actually gone to bat for some of the occupiers. They insisted that this was just a Canada Day like celebration, which those of us who live here would not characterize as such. But a lot of that is stemming from their trying to tap into a particular populist element that they think that they can gain support from. For the Bloc, it's a combination of old trauma from the 1970 invocation of the War Measures Act and trying to play to the favors of the Premier, François Legault, who says he didn't want any of the powers invoked within the province. And even though the government kept saying, if your police don't request the powers, they don't need to use them, they didn't take that as a sufficient answer. So you have to kind of look at what messages they were trying to send in terms of what their opposition was.
Jeff, Dale mentioned something that's been a message that has been echoed by a large majority of people in the Liberal caucus, NDP caucus, and basically anybody but Conservatives, saying that Conservatives have downplayed the situation in Ottawa. Obviously, in many cases, they brought beverages and such to the protesters as they were in Ottawa. That's what a couple of MPs have brought up in some of the other parties that have not been the Conservative Party, obviously. Do you agree with what Dale said?
No, not entirely. Look, let's look at some areas where, in fact, extraordinary powers were never used. The G20 protests, for example, did not require an invocation of the Emergencies Act. There we had actual violence with burning cars, windows being broken. Here we have in Ottawa, windows being broken by the police to drag truckers out of their trucks, in order to apprehend them. We also have, with respect to the current use of the Emergency Act powers, it's quite likely, and we may find this out in hindsight, unfortunately, that we've been lied to about charter compliance. We've had mobility restricted, assembly prohibited, or at least specific assembly prohibited. We have journalists who've been impeded, controlled in their access, or even outright arrested. Private businesses compelled against their will to provide services for the federal government, and several credible reports of Starlight cruises, taking people, apprehending them, and then just dropping them off in the middle of nowhere, 20 minutes outside of town, in well below freezing temperatures. These are acts we should be very concerned about. Unfortunately, I think the pattern of Bill Blair, who's the current public safety minister, in his role at the head of the G20 policing, are happy to take civilian oversight after the fact, apologize, and then restrict further the ability to act by future governments.
And Dale, just one final question to you. This is a message that's been spread largely by the Conservatives. They've kind of said, that the fact that a large portion of the events that happened at Ambassador Bridge, some of the situation in Coutts, Alberta as well, the Conservatives have said that a large portion of that was able to be cleared out without the Emergency Measures Act. What would be your response to that?
To a certain extent, yes, but Jason Kenney did request federal aid and then pretended that he didn't once the Emergencies Act was invoked. As well, in Ontario, the Premier, Doug Ford, did nothing for the Ottawa situation, even though it was largely within his jurisdiction, particularly policing. He didn't provide any meaningful reinforcements for the Ottawa police. He didn't invoke any of the powers that he could have at the provincial level, such as around insurance, or even requesting or compelling the tow truck services. So it's hard for the situations to necessarily be comparable.
Well, curiously, Dale makes the specific point why Justin Trudeau has not made a compelling case under the law itself. A failure of leadership by a premier or even a mayor is not a compelling reason to invoke the act. The statutes have to be lacking themselves, or there is no credible statute that could be used to bring this to an end. I don't think that threshold was met. We now have civil liberties groups seeking injunctions in court, and 7 premiers who have opposition to the use of these, the invocation of these emergency powers in this particular circumstance. Unfortunately, New Democrats lack the courage to end these powers, which, by the way, wouldn't have prevented a prime minister from re-invoking or issuing another invocation of these powers if a credible threat emerges down the road. But it looks like it's now going to take the courts potentially to issue injunction and determine matters of compliance with respect to the charter. We now await judicial review.
Okay, that is Dale Smith, journalist, freelance journalist in the Parliamentary Press Gallery, and Jeff Watson, former Conservative MP. Thank you both for joining me, and it's been great chatting with you both.
Thanks for having me.
You've heard some of the reaction earlier in the show from some of the other parties, with Dr. Amita Kuttner from the Green Party giving their perspective, as well as some reaction from a freelance journalist in the Parliamentary Press Gallery. And joining me now to share the Conservative perspective on the vote today that took place is Ryan Williams, who is the Conservative Deputy Shadow Minister for Industry. Thanks so much for joining me. Maybe we can start out with just a general reason. Obviously, you voted no to the vote that took place today. Maybe just give some of your overall reasoning as to why you made that decision to do so.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the Emergency Act, we feel it should be the last resort. So we felt that this was akin to a sledgehammer for the issues that this nation faced. And obviously, we looked at the blockades at the borders, which were very serious, and we looked at the encampments downtown Ottawa. But by the time the Emergency Act was enacted, the existing laws of Canada had already solved those issues. So our question in the House in the last 4 days of debate over Family Day weekend was, what else do you need this for? And we could not get that rationale, and we couldn't get those reasons, and therefore we just all decided that this was not what was required at this point. The existing laws were working in Canada, and we felt, especially with the financial overreach, it was overreach by government just looking to grab more power. We did not believe in that, and I certainly voted no for that.
The Bloc Québécois voted against the vote today, as well as one Green Party MP, Mike Morris, who also made the decision to do so. The Liberals and NDP voted in favor of the vote. In terms of the Conservatives and Bloc Québécois voting against it, obviously, in order for it not to have passed, you would have needed the NDP's support as well. Is there anything that you think you and the Bloc Québécois could have done that maybe you didn't do that could have, persuaded the NDP to vote against it?
No, we certainly made arguments, and I think there was combined certainly over 40 hours of debate in the House on the issue. So I know I had a lot of different colleagues that made great arguments and went on different lanes. I certainly spoke about the emotional impacts that Canadians have felt and the stigmatization they felt, and that's why they ended up over overpasses when truckers went underneath, and they ended up going to Ottawa itself. I feel that when we talked about the law and order and the need for peace, and that these were the fact that blockades and encampments were illegal, we all supported that. When we talked about the need to regain trust in government and ensure that we're healing this country, we spoke about that, and I spoke about that in my speech. when we talked about whether this was something where this act gave jurisdictional powers, even in Quebec, where right now there weren't really any issues. That's where the Bloc had the biggest issues, was that the Quebec government had said they didn't want these powers, as did Alberta and Saskatchewan and PEI and other provinces. And the Bloc focused on those rationales. And when it came to the historic precedents we're setting in having this act come to fruition, when the bar is so low, what is the next issue that we're going to be able to use this act? So again, going back to the fact that our existing police force had laws and they were already using those laws. We didn't need more laws. So why, again, did we have to have an emergency act implemented in order to do what we were already doing? And at the end of the day, the NDP and the Liberals had to vote on their own conscience. I would just say one last thing. We couldn't get a direct answer, so we normally assumed it was a yes. We were told this is going to be a confidence or non-confidence motion in the House, meaning that if it was defeated, if the NDP had voted against it, we would have been to an election in perhaps 36 days.
And so then maybe just one final question. In terms of how long this act will be into place, obviously the Conservatives didn't want it in, the first place. The Liberals and NDP obviously did want it. In terms of how can you, as the official opposition and as the Conservatives, how can you, I guess, fight for the position that your party is holding, and I guess try to have this act in place for as short as possible, as your party is obviously hoping for?
We've already put a motion forward tonight that's going to ask the act to be revoked as soon as possible. So we'll be bringing that to the House, I would imagine, weekly, until that we see that act revoked. So the motion would state that given that this is not an emergency, that we've satisfied the original intent of this motion, that the government's going to have to answer daily and weeklies, and we're back in the House in 1 week today. They're going to have to answer why this act is still in place and why the emergency powers they've granted themselves are still there.
Okay, that is Ryan Williams, Conservative MP from Bay of Quinte and the Deputy Shadow Minister for Industry. Ryan, thanks so much for joining me, and it's been great chatting with you.
Thank you as well, Wyatt. All the best.
With me now is Scott Reed. Scott, thanks for joining me. Maybe we can start out with the Emergency Measures Act that was just voted on at around 8 o'clock today. Obviously, the final results being 185 to 151. So obviously, it was relatively close. Obviously, the government passed it along with the support of the NDP. The Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois did vote against it, along with one Green Party MP. And I asked this to a guest that I had on earlier in the show as to what kind of a message should this send to the government that, the Conservatives voted against it, the Bloc Québécois voted against it, and the Green Party MP voted against it. And obviously they're voting against what is what has been a very divisive issue amongst not just political parties, but amongst Canadians.
I think the message is pretty clear. It's probably one I hope they appreciate already, which is be economical. You're granting yourself amazing authorities, and they should be used with great discretion, great care, and great limit. So, I think just as important as what you've mentioned, you can argue that it's unsurprising the Conservatives and the Bloc might oppose these measures, but you also heard speeches from a number of Liberal MPs who said, all right, if this is a confidence matter, I'm not going to vote against my own government, but I have grave reservations here. And so I think the message is, this is not your garden variety piece of legislation. This is not your garden variety measure. If you're going to give yourself this kind of power, you better use it with extraordinary care.
Do you think in terms of, obviously, I guess my question is, do you think MPs should have had the ability to vote more of their conscience on this piece of legislation, as opposed to it seems as if some MPs voted based on, as you mentioned, they didn't want to go into a confidence vote?
I don't, but I'm a creature of politics, and I'm a creature of party politics. I believe strongly in party politics. I think that those members of parliament were elected largely on the basis of their leaders' appeal and their brand as a political party. And I think that you hang together or you hang apart. And so I'm not at all troubled by the fact that Mr. Trudeau started talking about confidence today, and started, leaving the impression that we could possibly be forced into an election if this doesn't pass. That's exactly what I would have advised him if I'd been in the Prime Minister's office, because, if this isn't a confidence matter, what is? This is a sweeping piece of legislative authority you're granting yourself as a government in response to a significant crisis and event. And the eyes of the country are upon Parliament. That doesn't happen every day. So I think it is a confidence matter. I think you should vote the party line. And if you're not going to vote the party line, well, you better be prepared to pay the consequences. So I think the whip should be on.
Let's also just note that if there was to be an election, you'd be back to doing cursive politics every day, which I'm sure everyone would enjoy. What do you think the future of some of the things that the demonstrators in Ottawa were protesting is with the invocation of the Emergencies Act, given that obviously they were protesting things like vaccination mandates, etc. What do you think the future of some of those issues are?
Well, a couple different things. So first of all, I hope that the future of the Emergencies Act is extraordinarily short-lived. It's they've granted themselves a 30-day window. They could extend it. My hope is that it will be quite shorter than that. I'm not among those that says, well, since they've cleared the streets, we don't need it anymore. I think they have to ensure that they've got the authority to manage any incoming problems. So I think they also have to have the authority to manage the financial authorities that they've given themselves. But it should, that power and that authority should be withdrawn as quickly as possible. Days, not weeks, and certainly no more than a couple of weeks. In terms of the legacy of the convoy and the protests and the demonstrations, I think it's going to be significant. I think we're going to have what the Americans call a culture war election in the next federal election, meaning that the fault line isn't going to be about an issue. The fault line isn't going to be on partisan terms. It's not going to be about geography or language. I think the fault line is going to be about culture. It's going to be an us and them. I think we've seen COVID and all the frustrations that has created in terms of measures. I think we've seen the convoy and their occupation of Ottawa. And I think we've seen a Conservative Party that's decided it is absolutely committed to a populist, hard edge kind of politics. The combination of all those factors means that we're going to get, again, what the Americans call a culture war politics. It's going to be us and them. It's going to be the elites versus the anti-elites. And it's going to be all that kind of language. And I think it's going to be a nasty, important, and consequential election. And I guess, in terms of the mandates, they'll dissipate very quickly, provided there are no new variants. If there are new variants, well, then, you know what? We can all complain and scratch and complain and all that. But, if we have to do what we have to do to keep people and families safe, then we'll have to go back to it.
Okay, so that is Scott Reid. Scott, thanks so much for joining me, and it's been great chatting with you.
Thank you, Wyatt. Have a great night.